As to Maryland, Mike Emanuel, Fox News.
One of the standard bearers for the conservative movement has died. Former North Carolina Republican Senator Jesse Helms passed away early this morning at the medical center bearing his name at Wingate University in North Carolina. He was 86 years old. Chief Washington correspondent Jim Angle looks back at Helms' career.
There was hardly a more unmovable force or a more determined advocate for conservative views than Senator Jesse Helms.
He was a principled leader who had power of convictions and didn't much care what other people said about him.
Thiessen, now a presidential speechwriter, once wrote a heated letter to the New York Times for criticizing Helms.
He took a look at it and marked it up a few places and gave it back to me, and he said, "Son, I just want you to understand, I don't care what the New York Times says about me, and nobody I care about cares what the New York Times says about me."
He was fiercely opposed to racial quotas, gay rights, and especially abortion rights, but was equally famous for being a staunch anti-communist, a position he championed as the longtime chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, even opposing one of Ronald Reagan's proposed arms control treaties.
He took a very negative view of arms control dealings with the former Soviet Union. He was very skeptical of the efficacy of international organizations like the United Nations.
He actually spoke to the United Nations in 2000 and let diplomats know in no uncertain terms they needed to reform their ways, especially on spending.
It may very well be that some of the things that I feel obliged to say that will not meet with your immediate approval, if ever.
On domestic issues, Helms' chief concern was abortion.
He made it clear every opportunity where he stood on abortion. He was pro-life and strongly pro-life.
But he generated the most controversy on race relations. Helms was an old-school politician in the South who had opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
I thought it very unwise, and it was taking liberties away from one group of citizens and giving them to another.
And he made racial quotas an issue in his re-election campaigns, especially in 1990 against Harvey Gantt, the African-American former mayor of Charlotte.
You needed that job, and you were the best qualified. But they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota.
Helms went on to win close elections against Gantt in 2 races. Some critics argue Helms was a racist, but longtime associates insist he was motivated by principle.
Well, I think there was very widespread feeling in America against preferential treatment or quotas if you're trying to move to a colorblind society.
Many conservatives give Helms the most applause for having elevated Ronald Reagan.
There would have been no Ronald Reagan without Jesse Helms. When Ronald Reagan ran in 1976, he had lost a whole series of primaries leading up to the North Carolina primary, and his advisors were telling him to drop out. And Jesse Helms delivered North Carolina for Ronald Reagan and restarted his campaign and that made him a viable candidate in 1980.
Democratic Senator Joe Biden reflected the views of many today, saying Helms always fought tenaciously for his beliefs. And though we disagreed more often than not, he said Helms was always a gentleman. Biden said even though Helms was often called Senator No, he said Helms forged many pragmatic compromises for the good of the nation and the world. Brett?
Jim, thanks. Coming up later on the Grapevine, if you hated the 55